All right, we are recording, and welcome to everyone to Happy Hour with me. I am Eileen Cook, and we're going to jump in and get started because we have lots of things going. I see you here, Peggy, but just so you know, you're muted just in case you suddenly want to speak on something, just so you know. Just a couple housekeeping things before we jump in. So I will be away next week, which I know is devastating to all of you, but try and be brave, try and be strong. I am going to put up in my absence a masterclass on dialogue. So the dialogue workshop is kind of nice. It's me talking for 30 minutes, so you can enjoy me chit-chatting about dialogue. But there's also a fairly darn handy workbook. So if nothing else, if you don't want to listen to me, I understand that, although there is genius in there. There is a nice workbook that has a lot of prompts and things to kind of get you going on dialogue. So I'm going to put that up for next week so that people have it and they're welcome to it. But I am going to dive in because we have a couple things to go over today. We are supposed to go over Leslie's pages. I don't see her yet, but we're also going to do Scott's query letter. Thank you for sharing with us, Scott. So that's where I'm going to start unless anyone has any questions to get going with. I saw in the chat window, Peggy can't find her headphones, so she's going to stay muted, which is probably good. Then we don't have the background. And I see Leslie here now as well.
I finally figured out where you were. I'm sorry, I'm late.
Oh, you're fine. We're just going to get started. We're going to go through first Scott's query letter, and then we're going to hit your pages.
Great.
So let me see what we can do here. So if I am doing this correctly, you guys should now be able to see Scott's query letter.
Yep.
So we're going to jump in and I'll go through this, Scott, and then we can kind of hit and talk about things in bigger detail. And I'll explain to you why I made certain changes. So the first thing you had was you had Dear Brooks Sherman, and I just changed it over to Dear Mr. Sherman. And that's just in terms of, it sounds more right to me. It's sort of like if I get a letter that says Dear Eileen Cook, it just like it's either Dear Eileen or Dear Ms. Cook generally. I'm seeking representation for my YA novel, Jimmy's Dilemma, given your interest in contemporary social issues and representation of authors such as Becky Albertalli. I thought this would be a good fit. So the one thing I highlighted is, and this is more just me out of curiosity, when you say authors such as Becky Albertalli, is it that you think you have something in common with her, or you have some, like your book is in the same vein as hers? And you're muted, Scott, so I have no idea what you're saying.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, so it's she writes contemporary social issues, and so that's where the connection is. But I can see I can make it stronger there.
Yeah, I might just pick one of her novels if there's a particular novel of hers that you really think is a good match with that. Sometimes you do want to mention specific authors. So sometimes you'll see something like the books of, or books written by Becky Albertalli, something like that. Or sometimes people are deliberately trying to make a connection to a particular author. So they'll be trying to flag that my book is similar to these kinds of authors. So that's there. The next line reads, 13-year-old Jimmy is starting high school in a small suburban town, although he'd rather be back in the throes of summer kicking goblin butt with his steadfast friend Stefan. Awkward and naive, Jimmy desperately wants to fit in, or at least go unnoticed. So this is my first and probably biggest comment. If you're writing a main character who is 13, I don't think you're writing YA. I think you're writing upper middle grade.
Well, I've had this discussion with a number of people, and I've had and I've looked at a lot of middle grade books, and then I've also had my daughter's read it over as well, who's 14, and based on the content, and I understand Eileen where you're coming from, because I like one of the general rules of children's books is that people read up, but rules don't always have to be followed. And and the concern I have is that some of the sexual content will be that happens at the age of 13 and age of 14 will be too much for a 10 or 11-year-old to read.
This is probably going to be the biggest issue of debate. And I know exactly where you're coming from, because content is the big driver, right? That's often, even times you can have a young character that's an adult novel. So you can have a main character who's 12, who's the main character of an adult novel. So it has to do with what's the content of that story. I guess part of me thinking is like, what is the takeaway? And I mean, I have some bias because I actually have seen at least an earlier draft of this book. So I'm guessing it hasn't changed hugely significantly, but I can see it also being helpful to boys who might be in that kind of 10 to 13 range, where they're kind of coming into these feelings of sexuality and, dealing with like, holy cow, my body is doing things that it didn't used to do all by itself. So where they may be your target age, whereas I worry that kids who are 14, 15, 16 are like already been there, done that, and they're on to the next thing. So it may be a slight handling of it. Like, I don't think the topic of sexuality and growing feelings, and we'll get back to that at the very end, because I had some books for you to check out.
So just to come back, I'm not against wherever it's best positioned. I'm totally fine to do that. When I've looked at books for children, most of the middle grade are things like Captain Underpants, like really kind of fantasy type characters that are larger than life. And then there seems to be this, and I'm not saying it's entirety, but then there's a large gap from like having a character that's 12 to around a character that's 16, 17. There aren't a lot of, and maybe it is because of this exact dilemma that we're talking about, is because, the 13, 14-year-olds want to read about a 16, 17-year-old. And so, but if there's, if it could be, could fit in, and it's not going to end up being like, this is kind of awkward for a 10-year-old. But yeah, I'm fine positioning as we think is best.
Yeah, I would probably consider it an upper middle grade, because I would consider like Captain Underpants a younger middle grade, also terribly immature. But that's a separate issue. I do think there is a home for it. And in fairness, part of what we're talking about is just making sure that someone reads let the publisher figure out how they want to market this.
Yeah, okay.
If a publisher wants to make it a YA, they can make it a YA. I might describe it as an upper middle grade just because of the main character and people maybe instantly bumping on that.
Okay.
I did want to highlight, I loved Kicking Goblin Butt in that paragraph, because I think that tells us a lot about who Jimmy is and is kind of a unique to his character. But I did have the line, awkward and naive, just Jimmy desperately wants to fit in or at least go unnoticed. I wonder if there's something around how he's different, or maybe this is just me and I was just awkward and naive at 13, but I just wonder what makes him stand out, because the Goblin Butt for one is one example where to me that just feels unique. That's Jimmy. That's the different from anyone else. Like if you had said spending the summer playing games with his steadfast friend Stefan, that just wouldn't tell me much, but choosing Goblin Butt tells me a little bit more about him.
Is it a fantasy?
No, it's Goblin Butt playing D&D.
I completely missed that.
Maybe kicking imaginary goblins.
I never played D&D as a child.
What's wrong with you?
But I have to leave immediately. But no, I looked at that and I went, I thought it was somehow fantasy, and I was reading through.
I'll come with you, Tony, because I missed the whole boat.
Both of you.
If it was D&D
D or video game, that's a good point.
Yeah, I kind of went with the video game, just given, that's more my milieu. with my own son, but yeah. So if it's going to be D&D and that's important, that maybe a distinction. I don't know how to do that, but
That's actually interesting to, from a metaphor, you know, if you're kicking goblin butt or killing aliens or, you know, something virtual, then that may be able to use that in the real world.
Yeah, and actually, strangely enough, you are bang on, Tony. There are definitely lessons he's learning from the games that he plays that he applies to his real world. I like that. I obviously don't have any comments on that middle paragraph. Things don't go as planned because we're just sort of getting an introduction to the other characters that are going to be in here. The next line, trying to prove himself, Jimmy joins the football team and the distance grows between him and his friends. Life doesn't get easier for Jimmy once his body becomes sexually active. I just bumped on the part his body becomes sexually active just because it sounded like his body was doing something all by itself, like it was having sex and he wasn't involved. Like, my body's become sexually active, but I haven't. That just could be me. I'm a little weird like that. But I just wondered about that life doesn't get any easier for Jimmy once his hormones kick in or his body starts like something where it's clear that it is him.
Okay.
By far, your strongest paragraph in this query is this next one. When it's revealed that Stefan's gay, Jimmy questions his own identity. Stefan becomes the target of the bully and gets beaten up while Jimmy just watches. Jimmy's unsure of who he is and must choose between the identity he's leaving and the one he's becoming. The reason that that's the strongest paragraph is now we are very specific and we are dealing with the kinds of stakes that he's making. Now, I might make it more clear. Like, Jimmy's unsure of who he is and must choose between the identity he's leaving and the one he's becoming. Just being clear, like, he has to decide if he's going to stand with his friend or not. Is he going to, become just one of the cool kids, or is he going to stand with who his friends are? But that, by far, I think is your strongest paragraph because it is specific. So in terms of, as an agent, if you tell me, I'm writing a book that's a middle grade book, or a YA, because again, we're still not sure, about a guy deciding who he is and kind of getting over the awkwardness of high school, that just doesn't tell me enough, whereas this is a very specific thing. So I really quite like that specificity.
Okay.
You had the line, while many YA books spend more time on the A for adult, Jimmy's Dilemmas purposely focuses on the Y to bring the voice of many early teenagers to life. Readers will identify with Jimmy not so much as a character to aspire to, but the person many of us have been. Yeah, and you said, I'm not sure about this sentence, and that really gets into what you were talking about with, is it YA or is it middle grade? My biggest thing is you're spending a paragraph on something that I don't think necessarily adds to your query. I want to know more specifics about Jimmy or the story. Then you have... I'm a research professor with honors. Like, this is all great bio stuff because you have specifics and that kind of stuff. So it's nice. For other people, if you're freaking out because you don't have 160 authored and co-authored published pieces, that's okay. Don't worry about that. It's not required that you have it, but if you do obviously have it, it's nice to put that in because it's demonstrating that you've worked with an editor before, that you're comfortable with that process, and you know how all of that works.
Yeah. So Eileen, with this I was always debating about, because I recognize that the type of papers I'm publishing are quite different than creative writing publishing. And I've seen some agents say that, if you've got a PhD in physics and doing whatever, and you're writing something about a children's picture book, I don't want to know about your stuff in physics. And but others have suggested that, exactly like what you said, Eileen, that it at least shows that I've done something in terms of working with publishing and editing. So
yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, we're always playing this game with trying to figure out what an agent wants, and one wants to know one thing and one doesn't want to know another thing, and so you're always trying to figure out how to do that. I always try to defer toward, at the end of the day, if you're mentioning a detail, that it's either adding to your tone, and I'll have to see if I can find it, but on the Query Shark, which is a website by Janet Reed, she posts query letters. And one person put a quote about being a stay-at-home mom, something, and it was just hysterically funny. Like, it was a really funny line, and her book was funny. So she talked about the fact that she's a stay-at-home mom doesn't really make a difference, but the fact that she had this line and made it funny kind of added to the overall tone. I do think when you have something in terms of anything published, even again, if it is in a totally different genre, it can be really helpful. So I would include, lean towards putting it in, particularly if you still have some space for it. You're going to see, I put in some links, and I'll send this back to you, Scott, around some books for boys who are that 13 to 14-year-old age, to see whether or not there's some other comparables that you might want to look at that are kind of that target age.
Okay.
Yeah, that was my thoughts.
And anything like this last paragraph where this came out of where it said worked on with Y author editor Eileen Cook. Is that like, I hadn't seen that in a lot, but I was on a Twitter ask agent thing, and that was a specific question, and that agent said, yeah, if it's being worked on by a freelance editor, I want to know. Again, this is like guessing the agent thing, because I've seen other agents say that, I would hope it's being edited before you send it to me, regardless of who edited it.
Like, here's the thing, and I think you have a realistic perspective on this, but I think sometimes people include stuff like that because they think this is going to make the difference, right? Like, I know this person, as much as I would love to be like, I'm the next J.K. Rowling, I'm not. Like, you're able to say, like, I worked on this with J.K. Rowling and she loved it. That's going to grab someone's attention for sure. Alas, I'm not going to have that kind of sway. Tragically. But I mean, a lot of people would know who I am in the industry. And so it would be like, okay, it's been edited. Someone else has taken a look at it. As long as you're not thinking that's going to make or break your query. Like, the biggest thing that's going to make or break the query is this a story that I'm interested in, which you have zero control over it because you have no idea what they find interesting and what they don't find interesting.
Yeah.
So just forget about worrying about that. But, have you set it up? And I think the biggest thing, and you'll probably want to take some kicks, and we can go back and forth on email if you like, is just adding some more specificity. Like, this is a really cool story in part because he's coming to terms with his own sexuality and things, but also the adding in of like what he's learning from the games that he plays. So he plays these role-playing games, and he's learning from those about kind of who he wants to be, what he's doing, all those kinds of things. So that does make a difference. And I'm going to say, if people don't have their mute on, can they turn it on? Because I'm getting weird feedback. Oh, there. Now I don't hear it anymore. Now you can force to listen to me. All right. Are there any questions, just after I muted all of you, any questions else about this query? Scott, I will send it back to you. But the big things for other people would be like, as you're taking a look at this, noticing like what really pops for me is this one paragraph, and I'm pointing at it as if you can see I'm pointing at it. But when it's revealed that Stefan's gay, Jimmy questions his own identity. Stephen becomes beat up. He's watching it. And the reason is because it's very specific and it tells me what's at stake. Does he stand with his friend or does he not? And that's fundamentally what the book is about, because standing with Stefan is more than just standing with his friend. It's deciding who he's going to be in his character. Who is he going to be as an individual and as a person? Is he going to be the kind of person who stands up or not? So that's what I would say.
So I could just scroll up a little bit. So the one thing as I was reading through it and listening to it, I got confused whether Jimmy thinks he's gay, because Stefan's gay, and he says, you're unsure of who, you must choose between the identity he's leaving and the one he's becoming. So is he becoming gay, or is it another? Because when I think of identity, I think of sexual identity versus your character, right? How strong your character is. So that was, I was a little confused in that. And then the kicking goblin butt, I would, if I was doing this, I'd probably either say something, Dungeons and Dragons, or, intense video games or something.
Yeah, I think there could be a little like we'll be in the throes of summer, playing role-playing games while kicking goblin butt. Like I just love the goblin butt, so I want to leave it in. But clarifying what kind of goblin butt, that they're not real goblins, would probably be helpful.
Right.
All right. I'm going to close this out.
This is Bonnie. Can you hear me?
I hear someone.
This is Bonnie.
Oh, hi, Bonnie. What can I do for you?
I just wanted to go back to what you were saying about mentioning whether you've been working with another editor in a letter to an agent looking for representation. Because what do you think about this particular way that they might be thinking? Like, oh, so this person needs this editor, and I'm not really seeing what they're capable of.
I've heard that. I mean, I think most agents recognize that people are going to, if they're smart, like it doesn't have to be a freelance editor. It could be that you've put it through multiple times through your critique group. But God willing, you're never seeing our first drafts anyway. You're seeing something that has been cleaned up. I have heard some people say, well, if it goes, I mean, I think their biggest concern is you're probably going to go through a professional editor every time that you write a book, right? Like it's not going to be a one time. It is always going to be your process of kind of going through that, whether that's a freelance editor that you're paying or whether that's an editor at the publishing house. I think the biggest thing is oftentimes around timelines. So how long did it take you to get through this book? And are you going to be able to edit another book, say, in another year or two, or are you going to need 10 years to do it? Sometimes that can be an issue. But I probably would not be worried about saying that I'd had a book edited because I think most people are. And again, we kind of bump up against one thing that's always hard, which is for whatever reason, every agent seems to want something different. And as soon as you try and figure it out, it drives you insane because you have one person saying, please give me a long detailed bio or tell me why you're choosing me as an agent. And another agent will be like, I don't care about your bio, just tell me the story. Another agent will say, give me comparables. And next agent will say, don't bother with comparables, they drive me crazy. So basically this is just proof positive that querying is going to drive you insane. That's the goal. All right, I'm going to pop us over to Leslie's pages. So hopefully people can see those.
I'm so curious to find out what I sent you because I have so many versions and I have a new version now. Like,
we'll see which one this one is.
Yeah, it's not the right one, but that's okay. I couldn't find where I sent it to you.
I had two different versions, but I think this is the most recent.
I really need to delete. Anyway, it's not that different.
Which is actually, strangely enough, an odd reminder for people, because I do this as well, is sometimes looking at what you title your different versions as, so that you can more easily keep track. Like I used to title mine With Malice Final Version, which was always a lie because the next one became the final version. So I had like 8 final versions. So I actually ended up kind of borrowing from software. So I tend to be like, With Malice 1, With Malice 2, With Malice 3, With Malice 4. So I can always kind of tell where I'm at. The other way is doing it with date. So July 5th with Malice, July 20th with Malice, so that I can sort of see what that is. But jumping into Leslie's pages, so just off the first thing, cardboard boxes covered the floor of my bedroom, some sealed, others waiting to be filled. My violin case sat on the floor amidst the boxes. So things that I like is that we're starting, like whenever we're starting with boxes, we know something's afoot, something's going to happen. But there is an echo of boxes. So we have boxes in the first line and in the second line. So I might just change it to my violin case sat on the floor amidst the mess. Or something else. If people are worried about word echoes, which are the bane of my existence, I find them constantly in my own manuscript. So it's not you, it's all of us. If people have tried out Pro Writing Aid, we have a coupon for it in the Academy. We don't get a kickback, so it's not even like a push that way. But you can plunk in your writing and it'll highlight where there are any echoes. So I find that just a useful way because I just don't see them in my own. So one of the things that I highlighted or talked about in these pages is this character plays the violin, and the violin is important to her. And so details about the violin are going to go a long way to setting it up where I believe that this is truly what it is that she does. So particularly if you're picking that this is a character who is into mountain climbing, then I'm going to want you to use some of the slang and terms around, and I know none because I know squat about mountaineering or whatever, but like, what are the clamps called? What, if there's a certain things with shoes, because it makes it feel more real and pop. In the same way, I don't know if you guys have ever had the experience of reading a book about something you happen to know a lot about, and it drives you crazy because they have so many details that are wrong. So for example, I can't remember what the book was, but it was a character who was a writer, and they were like, oh, I'm going to do this. And then their book was coming out from a traditional publisher like 3 weeks later. And I was like, no. So, I mean, it just threw me completely out of the book because it was like, there's no, like, clearly that just does not happen. Or just, the use of terms, because those are terms we use. So if I hear, a character in a book who's a writer talking about, oh, so-and-so was a pantster, he just wrote whatever came to his mind. Like, then if I'm not a writer, I understand what the term pantster is, but it also gives me the feeling like, oh, now I'm in the know. So the example here, like, the familiar caress of smooth ebony against my skin brightened my stormy mood a tiny bit. There was just a little bit of detail about the violin, and also I just really quite like this. A few down, it says, no, if I wanted to hold off this sense of impending doom, I needed a bigger distraction. So the reason I liked impending doom is because as a reader, it gives me the feeling of upcoming tension. So impending doom tells me something bad is about to happen, or at least in her perception, something's bad about to happen, and it's going to pull me along to wanting to read that. You're going to see a few places where I combined things that you had. So you had them as separate paragraphs. So for example, no, if I wanted to hold off this sense of impending doom, I'd need a bigger distraction than that. Then you had, quote, new paragraph. I settled on a new skill I was trying to master. Chopping, the act of skillfully dropping a bow onto the screens, blah, blah, blah. And the reason I pulled that together is when we separate things out, and this is a great technique for everybody to be thinking about, but when you split things out, so you have a line that's suddenly all by itself, that line has a huge amount of impact to it because it has been split out. So wanting to make sure you're saving that for when it's going to have its most amount of oomph. And you'll see a little bit of that as we go along. So there's this description here of cat being stabbed with a red hot poker screech. It's again just a really nice kind of little detail. More details about the violin. And then here's an example of where I feel like it has more impact. So frustration mounting, I smashed the bow down harder and harder, convinced that more force was the answer. Paragraph break, it wasn't. Paragraph break. That line being set out just has more oomph. But if you do it too frequently, then you lose your oomph. So you're going to see places where I brought those together. So as I scroll down, she has a line, dropping the useless instrument inside its case, I kicked it to the corner of my bedroom. It slammed into a stack of boxes. A few fell, so I kicked those too. I just questioned if she would kick her instrument. It isn't a case, and like you can tell, I have zero musical talent. I'm not sure how protected that, like if she's kicking it knowing that it'll be safe, I might add something around that line.
It'll be safe.
Just because for me, who doesn't play an instrument, like all I can think of is I know she's really frustrated, but I also think of how much she loves her violin. Like it's kind of like kicking her puppy, which one should never do. So I didn't know, like maybe like dropping it into its useless case, I kicked it into the corner of my bedroom. If she even just has a moment of where she feels bad about kicking it. Something to think about. We've been talking actually about teen and YA voice, so I wanted to kind of highlight a line here. So footsteps pounded up the stairs. The scent of vanilla, heavily laced with lavender, announced Mom's arrival before she even knocked on my door. She opened it, walked in without waiting for permission, like she always did, like I was 5, not 15. That's just a great example of teen voice. Like that's how they feel, right? So I just think you've done a really nice job of kind of nailing that frustration that she feels. And it's also telling us a fair bit about the relationship with the mom. So if you had written it like, she opened it and walked in without waiting for permission. She treated the house as if it was her own and as if she didn't need my, like it was my, like there's something about like I was 5, not 15. Like that's just has that for me, that sense and feel of the frustration that comes with being that age. So I quite like that. Little trims. Remorse for my poor violin hit me. Fine, it's not a piece of junk. Does she have any more regret for breaking it? So this broke when she pounded the bow on and used all this force.
Right. The bridge just snapped off, which rendered it useless until it's fixed. It's not a huge deal, except that she can't fix it herself.
Yeah.
It's not broken. It's just
and then maybe then just making that maybe a tiny bit more clear.
Okay.
And again, like maybe it's just one, like inside, like if she feels any guilt about calling it a piece of junk. And again, I'm like, to me, it's like, I totally get her frustration. And I understand that that's what you're communicating is like, she's just annoyed.
Right.
But at the same time, like this is probably one of the things she has the most close of a relationship with, strangely enough, which is her instrument.
So am I allowed to say something or should I wait till the end?
Yeah, no, of course you can say something.
So if she said something like, guilt hit me for, treating my violin so roughly or something like that.
Yeah. So, like it's that kind of thing around sort of like when you snap at a friend because they're your friend and you know that they will do it. But as soon as you say something kind of snotty, you feel really bad that you just did that. Right. And to me, like it's, even though we're talking about an inanimate object and generally we don't think of them as having feelings, I almost feel like, and again, I'm doing a little bit of extrapolation around, I know a few people who are musicians, but they tend to talk about their instrument as if it is an animate object. Like it is like it's someone that they know that has feelings that, would be hurt. Like they'll talk about if they haven't played, that they feel bad for ignoring their instrument as if the instrument cares, which it doesn't.
Well, she certainly does that to the next violin. So that's perfect. That's a bit of foreshadowing there. I like that.
So I think that would work well. And this is a place just in terms of, since we've been talking about stakes and being specific in terms of Scott's query, she has the line, and we won't be able to fix it until after we move. How am I supposed to practice? So this is just a place where you can give us just a hint more because it raises the stakes. So she's been talking about moving and that she doesn't want to move. But there's a difference between you're kind of moving across town and what that's like versus I'm moving across the country versus I'm moving to a different country. So having, and just again, because I happen to have a little bit of knowledge of this story, I know she's actually moving quite far away. Like this isn't a thing where she's going to be able to, drive 1 hour and see her friends again. Like this is a big move. And so this is a place I would drop that in because we're very early in the story and that establishes the stakes. This is a big move and it's going to be a painful move. And that's a place where we can kind of have that sense of what she's really potentially risking. So we're going to do that. This is another example of sort of teen voice. So mom clucks her tongue. Your life would be so much easier if you just planned it better. Just such a parent line, first off. Like everyone else have a flashback to their parents saying something like that. And she has the internal thought, no, your life would be easier. Writing teen voice, and I've had this discussion with people, like, does it always just come down to being snarky? And no, it doesn't. It's not that a teen voice automatically means snarky, but there is an element of higher snark per capita than we would see in an adult novel. And that is partly because this is, keep in mind where this age is. This is the age where you are trying to figure out who you are. You definitely feel like an adult, right? You feel like you are a grown adult who's being treated like a child. This is the age where you're pretty sure that your parents don't know anything. But you're also, unfortunately, at the age where you have very little autonomy or control. So one of the things I often think about when I'm writing YA is when I was in high school, a girl that I'm going to hesitate to say friends with, a girl who was in my larger social circle, so I knew her. Her parents found religion, and not like kinda, like her parents found serious, fundamental, raise the roof, barn burning Jesus kind of religion. So her parents took all of her clothes, most of which she had saved up for, like with her summer jobs, like all of her jeans, her swimsuits, all of that stuff, and they torched it.
Oh.
Wow.
They got rid of all of it, and then they got her basically the Duggar wear. So everything was long sleeves, full-length skirts, modesty before all other things. And she was so pissed. She went to the police because they actually burned her clothes because she refused. What would happen is she would leave the house in the clothes that her parents got her, and then she would change at school, like all of us did. But her parents found out about that, so they burned her clothes. So she went to the police, and the police are basically like, there's nothing we can do. Like, your parents have that autonomy when you're that age. Mm-hmm. It's not considered child abuse. So to me, like, I remember the injustice of that struck me like so strongly as a teen. And I try and think about it now, not again that I think most kids are dealing with that kind of injustice, but it is the kind of thing, like, if you're a senior in high school or you're 15 and your parents decide that they want to move across the country for a job or because they just gosh darn feel like it, you get no say in that. You can't say, I don't want to move. I don't want to do this. I don't want to leave my friends. It's just a case of too bad, so sad. If your parents want to get rid of your dog because one of them is allergic or a sibling's allergic, they can do that. So that's why I think there's a higher level of snark in teen novels, because that's about all they got. Is they have the ability to sort of make their unpleasantness known, and they often do.
Yes, I agree.
It's because you have
two.
teenagers.
I have two. Yes, I have two.
So making their awareness allowed. So this is just one thing to think about, is she squares her shoulders and says, suck it up, Anastasia. This stuff isn't going to pack itself. It's just to keep an eye on how many things does she say out loud or in her head, because I think there was a line, at least at one point, where she had something else that she was saying out loud. And just for most of us, which is not universal, but most of us aren't saying that stuff aloud. We're saying it inside of our head, mostly because we worry about parents or younger siblings hearing what we're saying. So we sometimes will do that. So it's not necessarily that I would change this, but it's something that I would think about. Now, the next thing I wanted to point out was a nice listing of setting that gives us a lot about the character. So the character turns to the bookcase. A large trophy stood in the middle on the top shelf. My best friend Clara and I had won first place in Odyssey the Mind competition for our rather impressive robot. The design was my idea, but the calculations required and the construction had been all Clara's. Besides that sat a smaller trophy, one I got for an essay written about the plight of albinos in Africa. Next to the trophy was my latest gift from Clara, Shakespeare's quips, cusses, and curses. So this is a paragraph where, in theory, we're just seeing the kinds of things that she has to pack. But for those of us who are reading this, we're getting a lot about the character of Anastasia. She's someone who builds robots. She is someone who likes Shakespeare. She's someone who, obviously, she has this essays. She's clearly bright and capable, right? So much is coming through that. There's a little bit more because she has some picture frames here in the next paragraph that she's talking about. So just using that setting to tell us a lot about the character. So that is something to think about. And we've all seen that weird writing exercise that shows up at conferences or various writing books, which is like, tell me what's inside your character's refrigerator. Tell me what your character would have in their purse. And sometimes we find it frustrating because we're like, ketchup? They've got milk? I don't know. What you're looking for are those details that would pop. So if you open my refrigerator and there's nothing in it other than a giant, now I have to think of something that would be really bizarre, ostrich egg, you're going to have some questions about that. If it's filled with certain kinds of food, that's going to tell us something about that kind of person. So if you open my refrigerator and there's the truffle pesto sauce and the 5 different kinds of balsamic vinegar. And there's, like, without me saying anything else, I'm showing you that I'm a foodie. If there's nothing in your or in your refrigerator that's going to set you apart, don't describe it. But this bookcase is a nice way of sort of showing us who this person is by showing us what's there.
I'm so sorry.
That's all right.
My
I like it's a little musical interlude.
My computer froze. I missed everything. Last I heard, we were talking at you. We were kind of at the point where she talks to herself out loud.
Yes,
and
I'm saying trim that. I would have her say it inside her head, and then you'll see it because I'm going to send you the notes. But I think that I was giving you kudos and talking to other people around how the use of what's in her bookcase tells us a lot about her. The only thing I don't think you need is at the very bottom, we have, at the bottom shelf held my favorite books, a dog-eared copy of Wuthering Heights, a collection of Shakespeare's plays, and a scattering of other volumes, none of which were written by authors alive in this century. The reason I don't think you need that one is I'm not sure that you're adding anything new.
Okay.
Because, like, I love the fact that Clara, her friend, gave her the Shakespeare's quips, cusses, and curses. So I already kind of have a sense of who she is, and I already know she's a bit of an academic.
Right. Okay.
So I would tend to trim that out of there.
Okay.
Mom and Dad are dragging me to some godforsaken town in the middle of nowhere. Again, giving us a little bit of idea about where this is going to add to the stakes of that. You'll also see again that I've moved some paragraphs together because you had them separated out. So here's one where I actually forgot to leave a space. Let's put that back in. But you had this as a separate line, and then this one is a separate line. And I would just move those up, because when you have the line here, and that's when things got weird, it's way more boom for the buck if that line is separated, but the others have been grouped together.
Okay.
It's going to pop. I did also want to flag, there was no before Clara in my memory, just because I think that is a very sweet line, and it tells us a lot about kind of who she is as a character. So I like that. And then for other people, the chapter ends. So she picks up a picture wrapped in a selective tissue around the frame, and that's when things got weird. One minute I was in my bedroom holding the picture frame, and the next I was somewhere else. It's just a nice chapter end, because I'm going to bet most of us are going to flip the page, because I want to know what happened. I want to know if she was actually teleported, or if it's that kind of thing, like I was looking at something and suddenly I was thrust back in the memories of time with blah, blah, blah. Again, I know a little bit more about this book, so I know there's a little something special going on. But I would think for most readers, they're going to want to read that because it has that kind of flash to it. All right. Any questions for you, Leslie?
I have one question.
Yes, ma'am.
Anastasia talks to herself a lot in this whole thing. Sometimes out loud, very often out loud, because she's an only child. And sometimes she has these conversations in her head with these two people, which you probably recall, drama girl and rational girl. So I put that line in there as her talking about out loud. And I actually took out the first one where she says, she's talking to herself about don't do it. I took that one out, but I left this one in because I sort of wanted to set it up that this is very normal for her to talk to herself.
Oh, I think it's totally normal for people to talk to themselves. I just would be careful that she doesn't talk aloud to herself too often, because that's less normal. And I say this as an only child who had a very active imaginary life and had a lot. I am my best conversationalist to this day. I still probably talk a lot to myself. I don't do it out. Yeah. Well, then you're just weird, Leslie. Now allow me to just flag something.
That was given.
You are a writer. We've already established you're weird.
Okay, so should I take it out or put it in like an internal thought?
I'm just flagging it because I think there was another one, or there might have been another one, because I read 2 versions of this because I was curious. You sent me 2 versions, so I was curious to see what had changed. So I can't remember if she has another line where she says it out loud. Hang on.
It does at the very first page.
Yeah.
But I took that out.
seriously, universe, today, you had to do this to me today. Like that was one I totally saw her saying out loud. And I thought there might have been one other one.
Right, the second line.
No, don't do it. Mom's going to freak out. Okay. So that was just like, at that point, now that's 3 different things she said in 5 pages out loud to herself.
Okay.
Just a lot of talking to yourself out loud, which is not necessarily to say, again, a lot of talking to yourself.
Right.
Just how much you want to have as a, like where she's saying it, because it's just that thing where I think people bump on it a little bit.
Right.
Or you make the decision that, gosh darn it, this is who she is. She's a person who talks out loud to herself. But then I might have someone comment on it. Like, so I might have someone say, like, overhear her at some point, or say something where it's that kind of moment where we just have a sense like she's a quirky bird. You can get away with a lot of unusual things, oftentimes if you're just acknowledging that it's unusual.
Right.
Even if sometimes we talk a lot of times about in fiction that you shouldn't have coincidences, because even though they happen in real life all the time, because it throws people in fiction to feel like it's a cheat. I think you can get away with like 1 or 2 things of coincidence in a book, but I sometimes them acknowledging, like the character saying, like, what are the odds that would, like, I can't believe that, just so that there's sort of a tip of the hat to the reader that we know that we're cheating a tiny little bit. I think that's a useful process.
Thank you. That's great.
So I am going to send this back to Leslie Scott. I will send your query back to you as well so that you have it. Marianne, did you have a question? I think earlier you had said you had a question.
I did. And it's interesting that when you got to the end of Leslie's chapter, you commented on the hook, the question that's raised. Possibly nobody else has this problem, but I've always struggled with chapter breaks and where to put them, because I structure and write my books in scenes. And I start with some pretty approximate chapter breaks based on major story points, but they don't always feel relevant when I get to the end of that scene and say, okay, that's the end of a chapter. This is the beginning of a next chapter. And I feel like I'm missing a whole bag of tools about both knowing and refining my scene endings so that it's very deliberate, and I know what I'm doing, and I'm pacing the story properly. And I'm getting better after 14 years. I'm getting better, but I'm still grappling with that question. So any advice you can offer on that point?
I mean, I can say for myself, similar to you, I write in scenes, and I just often have one giant, huge chapter length book when I'm done, because I haven't yet figured out. Or what I used to do is just completely put them in randomly. So I would have some chapters that were 50 pages, and then a chapter that was 3 pages, and then a chapter like they were all over the map. So now I don't worry as I'm writing. I just write in the scenes, and then I go back and I start thinking about this. And I think it is really relevant, not just because of where Leslie chose to break this chapter, but also just thinking in terms of using the actual physical space on the page to pull people along. So there's always advice for acting, which, and when they're doing filmmaking, is they say you want to start later than you think and get out sooner than you think. And I think that's actually fairly good advice for chapters as well. As sometimes we spend a lot of time in the opening of a chapter setting up things that don't need to be set up. And then we keep going when we should have ended and gotten out. So if you break a chapter in the middle of action, which is what Leslie's done here, right? Something big has happened. This is the equivalent of, I opened the door and I couldn't believe who was standing out there. Like the entire point of ending in the middle of action is the goal that you're trying to have is that someone's going to be yanked into the next chapter because they're going to want to know who's standing outside the door. In Leslie's case, we're going to want to know what happened to this girl, what happened to Anastasia, where has she been pulled to?
So, but does that mean that a chapter break can happen in the middle of an actual scene?
Yep. It surely can.
even harder for me to decide because my scenes are like things.
And again, this is why I'm not worried about it usually until revision. And I am using that technique of kind of ending in the middle of action. I don't want to do it all the time because I also think it's slightly exhausting to people.
Yes.
And it can feel a little bit like, cut it out already. Like it's a trick. It's a flashy thing. Like I've been watching fireworks lately because it's been a fireworks festival here in Vancouver. Like you get a big bang certain times, but if you use a big bang too often, it loses its impact and its oomph. So if you're going to end in the middle of action, choose when to do that wisely. So this is an opening chapter for Leslie. As I recall, this is chapter 1.
So in terms
that
of story,
has that oomph, right? Like we've gotten them started. And really, if you think about it, this is a low stakes chapter, right? As a lot of opening chapters sometimes are, because we're just trying to introduce the world. Here's this character, she's getting ready to move. But this book has fantasy elements in it, or magical realism, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. So I think Leslie's trying to make sure that we get to that pretty quickly and that we have a sense that there's something else going on. Because if she has too many chapters that are set in the contemporary world and all of a sudden magic shows up, readers are going to be like, wait a minute. So she's ending on that, and then we're automatically wanting to yank into the next one to know what's going to happen.
So if I were going to look at my big endless stream of scenes and try to figure out where to use those big bangs, would the major story turning points make sense to focus in on, like the opening hook, obviously, and because you want to grab the reader and get them involved, but then like at the turning points, story turning point.
Turning points are a great time to look to see whether or not there's a good oomph for your bang there. Like if that's going to be a payoff. I'm also looking at pacing. So Tony was talking, I think before we even started recording, about when he's all done, he's giving a numerical ranking to his scenes based on the amount of tension. And again, that's completely arbitrary. So he's saying like if 1 is a low stakes scene and 10 is high stakes racing around, just kind of where certain scenes are. So if I had a bunch of scenes that were at that kind of 4 or 5 level, one is I might be looking to be like, okay, well, can I increase the tension somewhere in here? But one way of sometimes increasing tension for the reader is to leave them hanging. So that might be another place where it may not be a major story turning point, but when I'm looking at the overall pacing of the book, I worry that we're in a quieter phase of the book and that it's becoming easier for the reader to potentially put it down. And we know that readers are, and I do the same thing, like you read to the end of a chapter, and if that's a good place to put it down, that's a good place to put it down. We're less likely to put down a chapter or a book in the middle of a chapter. Not impossible. Obviously, it's going to depend on what's going on in our lives, but that's kind of a natural breaking point. If you're a knitter, you're most likely to put your work down at the end of a row. If you're a painter, let me finish this tree in the corner. If you're a carpenter, let me finish this, row of nails, and then I'll pause. So there's kind of automatic points in any project where it's a natural resting place. Sometimes you're going to have that. That's good. It's a bad thing. But sometimes if you're afraid there's been too many natural resting places, that's when I would be like, well, now I'm going to leave them hanging because then they're going to want to keep going.
And in terms of how you do that in relation to the scenes, you would just choose your chapter break on that hanging point, and then just carry on at the beginning of the next chapter with the balance of that scene and whatever.
Yeah, just keep her going.
I don't know if I'm.
Look, she's like, ew.
Control freak. It's like, oh, that's so hard for me. I wanted everything in tiny little boxes. I know that's bad, but
that's not bad. And again, like we're all talking about tools, right? So this is just a tool that will pull somebody into another chapter. That doesn't mean that everybody has to use this tool or that you have to use it multiple times, but it's another thing to have in your tool caddy. In the same way, Leslie was using breaking things out to have more oomph, again, on the page. So if she'd had the line, tears flooded my eyes as I picked up a picture and wrapped a sheet of tissue paper around the frame, and that's when things got weird. All as one line, it has less oomph as when the fact she broke it out into a paragraph, right? So another example would be like, I looked down in the paper. I couldn't believe what I'd seen. I couldn't believe what he had written. the asshole was cheating on me as a separate line and then a new paragraph. Like just by breaking it out, it's going to have an extra, And so looking for when you do that, but then making sure you're not doing it too often, because then it kind of loses that spark. So you're saving it for when it's going to have the biggest impact. All right. We are basically at time. So thank you to everyone. For people who came on a little bit later, just a reminder, next week I'm actually going away, so I will not be here, but I am going to be putting up a masterclass on dialogue. So you get a lovely lecture with me and a handy dandy workbook with all sorts of prompts. So please dive into that. If you have pages you would like to have reviewed, please email those to me, or a query you'd like to have reviewed, email that to me. Keeping in mind, you can also do dueling queries if you like. So we did do that with the other Bonnie, where she had 2 different versions of her query, and we had a chance to see both of those. So that is also an option, and we will dive into that.
Eileen,
and until then, yes, ma'am.
I just have a very quick question. If you are indicating that a character is thinking in their head, how would you indicate that? Just with italics?
I would go italics.
Okay.
That's my go-to method. Do it. You can say she thought to herself. Like those are also. But yeah, like I tend to find italics is the best way, and that's certainly what my editor usually defaults to, is italics.
That's what I think. Okay.
Can I ask one quick question too? Sorry.
Sure.
Besides queries and pages, are we able to submit a synopsis?
Sure.
Okay, thanks.
And who doesn't hate a synopsis? All of us. And if you haven't written a synopsis before, just wait. But yeah, I'd be happy to look at a synopsis as well. That's also great.
Can I ask one last question?
One last question.
I've been reading so much about the first sentence and the first paragraph and the hook, and I just can't do it. I mean, my hook is at the end of that. Does it still work? Like, is it compelling enough that you'd keep reading? Have I got,
I think we can drive ourselves crazy, and well, maybe some of us don't have that far to go with trying to do all that. Like, keep in mind, you can't, sometimes I think people try to start off too big of a bang. Like, I couldn't believe I'd been abducted. And, and then and the problem with that is sometimes I don't care because I don't know you. So I don't think we always have to start with the explosion. I think what we're trying to make sure that we're doing is that we're starting with something that is compelling, that makes people want to read. So the fact that she's moving is interesting to me, right? And there's a little bit of tension here because there's going to be, like, I want to know why she doesn't want to move. Now, is that going to be enough to keep me going all the way through? No, but things liven up as the chapter goes along, right? Like, if it was just that she didn't want to move, I would be like, give me a little bit more. And I think you can give us a little bit more, as I said, with a little bit of stakes in there, like that we're moving far away, and this means I'm losing my best friend. And then the big hook comes at the very end of that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Tony, or are you just waving goodbye? Bye. All right, everyone. I will not see you next week, but I will see you 2 weeks from now. So take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
How do I get out of here?